in view of the Quest for Legitimacy project and also the book that Jamie wrote about it, when the Queen passed yesterday, what was your first reaction in the context of the book that you've just written? Like, what were your first thoughts when it came to what is going to happen now for the next generation? What must the feelings be of the next generation in the royal family?
I could picture Russ and I having interviewed Charles as one of the subjects for the research project. So it's the death of the Queen, but it's finally the announcement that Charles is no longer a rising Gen family member and is ascending to the throne. Probably Russ and I have slightly different experiences because I'm in the United States and he's in the heart of it in England.
I think the context of what we're talking about with regards to the rising gen and their quest for legitimacy, how we can relate what's happened with the Queen recently and, as you say, King Charles' sort of ascension to the throne. It's separating out the fact that there is this human element to it because it's his mother that's passed away, but also the fact that he's been 73 years in the kind of waiting to take on this role as monarch, and it's an incredible period.
Talk to us a little bit about this concept of how you talked to these rising gens that are featured in the book. Why do we like to make them into giants? Why are these people so giantesque to us?
For us, the whole world can identify that the Queen was a giant and the unusual nature of a woman giant, because most of the giants we heard about were men. And most of the space talks about the knowledge that somebody has to have, the skills. And what we discovered was that there's really a path for those who grow up in the land of giants, in these prominent families. And this is also a wonderful example of the prominence being more important, the wealth or the business or all of the things that lived behind Queen Elizabeth.
What did they talk to you about in terms of like that sense of belonging, and why isn't it enough? Why does there need to be this sense of like proving yourself to be worthy of the family enterprise?
One of the overwhelming patterns that we saw from and heard from the participants was how isolating an experience it can be growing up in a prominent family, because not everybody grows up in that environment. And so your peers, your friends, the support network you have around you may not necessarily relate to the fact that it can feel very isolating. So if you imagine, say, and I'm completely making this up, I don't know Prince Charles at all, but you imagine him as a 30-year-old thinking, well, this is quite an isolating experience growing up as the son of a monarch. Where does he go to for support? Because there aren't a huge amount of people that grow up in those similar circumstances. And that's what we found with the participants as well, was that there was this isolating factor by growing up within a prominent family.
You talk about the transition points and breaking points. Can you tell us a little bit more about these two things, but also can you tell us whether a breaking point can actually be a transition point? Because I feel like that can often come hand in hand.
I'm going to push it a step further. Not only could it be a growth point and a transition point, it should be a growth point and a transition point. And thinking about families, divorces, all the things that go on, even getting married. So, we interviewed Henry Kaiser, who was third generation from the Kaiser family, that in some ways was at one point one of the wealthiest families in the world. Grandfather was involved in building the Hoover Dam. This was a huge family, a central point of the Industrial Revolution. And here he is, third generation, and he's grown up. He's been told he's to prepare for something. And lo and behold, as he marries, he is told that his grandfather is too ill to come to his wedding. And he goes and sits with him, expecting that's going to be the moment that grandfather and him can have a conversation about, is there a role in Kaiser Industries for him? And grandfather couldn't recognize the need to have the conversation. And he couldn't ask. And for him, that was the beginning of a series of events, what I would call a period of liminality, of being betwixt and between, that led to him really needing to sort out his life. But it all started with a marriage, which was an exciting moment, a happy moment in his life.
I love the word quest. Talk to us about this concept of the quest. So where does the idea of using this word come from? And then also, and I love this question actually that I have to confess my team brought forward, asking about whether a quest is embarked on spontaneously, or are there always pressure points, or do you need to encourage rising gens to get on that quest, or do you see it happening organically in most cases?
Jamie and I spotted patterns in the interviews that we had, but by placing it through a non-emotional filter of the academic research, they were able to identify the 4 phases that we've, or Jamie has written about within the book. So the first phase is awareness. You then have the second phase, which is the tug of war, which is the kind of, I've grown up within this environment. I'm aware of my reality, but I'm also aware there's another reality out there, and there's different things that being experienced outside of this institution of my family compared to what's happening within it. And that can lead to the third phase, which is an exploration of that. So it's kind of going out and looking at what the experiences that world can result in. It's looking at the family side becoming much more internalized and kind of growing your own legitimacy through that exploration. And the final phase of that is then ownership. And we don't mean ownership. I mean, ownership in family business terms is often referred to as ownership of the shares or assets within the enterprise family office, etc. We're talking about personal ownership. It's taking ownership of your life and the things that are happening within your life.
You interviewed 24 rising gens for the book, correct? Like this 24. So can I ask how many were men and how many were women?
It was about evenly split.
Any marked differences between the men and the women in terms of like how they looked at the situation that they were in, or how they recognized their quests, or how much ownership, I guess, like speaking of the fourth phase, how much ownership they eventually took for their fate? Like, did you see any marked differences? Did the academics find something, Russ, like that you didn't see before?
So it's cute because when I went to write the chapter in the book, I had a conversation with Leah Boyce, who is a woman runs a family office out of Australia.
In Melbourne, yeah.
And she said to me something about, I hope you're not going to write. I was getting ready to write the chapter about women. She says, I hope you're not going to write the chapter about our role as the communicators or the glue in the family or all of that kind of stuff. So I was very nervous writing the chapter. As a man.
You ought to be.
And what I decided to do was to take 3 stories of 3 different women who were very different. And one is kind of a classic example, so I'll just use that. She grew up in a family, and 3rd or 4th generation. And as she's stepping into a role on the board, she's reminded of her grandfather saying, if there's ever going to be a woman in the boardroom, she's going to be serving tea. And women couldn't get shares of ownership. Women couldn't work in the business. And obviously women couldn't be on the board. And she also was a couple weeks after delivering a baby. And so at some point, she had to ask the board whether she could take an hour break so she could breastfeed. Her story is a very powerful story because she really broke a glass ceiling and now is impacting the generation afterwards.
What are sort of the first few questions I need to ask myself? Like, what are the first few steps that I should be taking in order to feel that, I'm going to materially actually change my outlook on my personal situation within the family enterprise?
So I think the first one, and the goal of really writing the book, was to have a moment that you can begin to feel that you're not alone. And to kind of go, this is common. It's not part of even using the term prominence is that there are a lot of people who grow up in families where there's prominence and there may not be wealth, or there may be, reasonable amounts of wealth. Even in poorer communities, there are people who grow up prominent in those communities. And I think that's really important. But I think the second thing to ask, and we're in the middle of developing a little quiz to go on the website, was where am I in the quest? Because even identifying that, it's like, oh, well, I may go back into awareness. That's okay. But am I in the tug of war, or have I really emerged into a period of exploration? And is there room for that exploration? And where do I take agency in my life, and where am I struggling with it?
What we're seeing is the growth comes from people going through those processes, through going through the phases within the quest. Using a generic example of COVID, that was a big breaking moment for all of us. And yet a lot of the growth, a lot of the personal growth that has come from that is a result of us embracing that and having that agency, but also leading us to what drives us from a purpose perspective. There's been much more focus on that since that. And that's a global breaking point and a global period of liminality in the context of what we discovered on the quest. So identifying that there is a path is really important. Identifying you're not alone is really important. And there is help out there for you as well.